the ferryman who smuggled 110 Jews across the Sound on moonless nights. Søren Falk, intro. The final crossing, October 3rd, 1943. 2:47 a.m., Øresund, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden. The water was black as crude oil. No moon, no stars. Nothing but a total darkness that swallowed everything. Søren Falk rowed in perfect silence, every stroke measured to leave no sound behind, every muscle locked in the kind of focus only raw terror can produce. In his rotten wooden fishing boat, built for 4 people at most, 11 Danish Jews were packed in like sardines. 3 whole families, including a 6-month-old baby who'd been given laudanum drops so it wouldn't cry. The baby lay so still that every 30 seconds, its mother touched its chest just to make sure it was still breathing. 400 meters to the north, Søren could see the lights of the German patrol boat Seidler slicing through the strait, its searchlights combing the surface for exactly what he was doing. Human cargo headed for neutral Sweden. If those beams caught them, everyone would die. The Germans didn't take prisoners on the water. They shot first, asked later, let bodies sink, then filed the reported as smuggling incident neutralized. Søren had made this crossing 23 times in the last 3 weeks. He'd gotten 99 Danish Jews to safety. This was crossing number 24. 11 more would bring the count to 110 lives saved. But the Germans were learning his rhythms. Patrols had tightened. The routes he'd relied on were compromised. Tonight he was pushing through unfamiliar water, with no moon to orient himself, trusting nothing but the fisherman's instinct he'd built over 30 years on these seas. The patrol boat turned. Its searchlight swept straight toward them. Søren stopped rowing. He signaled for absolute silence. 11 people held their breath. The sedated baby made no sound. The beam passed within 3 meters. So close, Søren could make out the faces of the German sailors on deck, could hear them talking casually about the October cold, about how long until their shift change. Then the light moved on, scanning empty water to the east. The patrol boat continued its route, drifting away. Søren waited a full 5 minutes. 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours before he started rowing again. 30 minutes later, the boat scraped onto Swedish shore. 11 people stepped onto free land. 3 families who would never see occupied Denmark again. But who would live? The sedated baby woke up and cried, a sound that in occupied Denmark would have meant death, but in neutral Sweden meant only that a child was hungry. Søren didn't wait for thanks. He never did. He shoved the boat back into the water and began the return trip across the dark strait, back toward occupied Denmark, toward the next human load that needed saving. What the Germans never understood, what their patrols and searchlights and military strategy could never prevent, was that a 52-year-old Danish fisherman who'd known these waters since he was 7 was more dangerous to the Third Reich than an entire Allied battalion. Because Søren Falk wasn't only ferrying people, he was ferrying hope. And hope, it turned out, was harder to sink than any boat. Leave a comment. What would you do if you had to choose between your safety and the lives of strangers? Where is the limit of ordinary courage? This is the story of how a Danish boatman turned moonless nights into escape tunnels. How 30 years of a fisherman's knowledge outmatched the German Navy, and how 110 lives were saved by a man who simply couldn't look away. Part 1. The world before the Horrorgilleleje was a fishing village on Denmark's northern coast that in 1940 held around 1,200 permanent residents, doubling in summer when tourists from Copenhagen came to escape the city heat. The town stretched along a sheltered bay where the North Sea met the Kattegat, waters that had fed fishing families for centuries. Søren Falk was born on March 12, 1891, in a wooden house 50 meters from the harbor, so close to the water that winter storms sprayed salt against the windows. He was the third of 6 children of Henrik Falk, a herring fisherman, and Maren Falk, who ran a small boarding house during tourist season. Søren's life was mapped out from birth the way it was for every fisherman's son. Learn the trade, inherit the boat, fish until your body gave out, or the sea claimed you, whichever came first. At 7, he was in his father's boat learning to read currents. At 12, he could predict storms by the way the gulls behaved. At 17, he was fishing alone, in his own boat bought with 5 years of savings. When World War I broke out in 1914, Denmark declared neutrality. While millions died in trenches across Europe, Søren kept hauling herring from the Kattegat, like his father and grandfather before him. The war was a distant abstraction, something that happened somewhere else, to other people. He married Kirsten Nielsen in 1919, the daughter of a ship carpenter from Helsingør. They had 3 children, Lars in 1920, Bjørn in 1922, Astrid in 1925. They lived modestly but comfortably by fishermen's standards. Fish filled their stomachs. The catch paid for everything else. They weren't rich, but they never went hungry. And for most working-class Danes, that was all they expected from life. People considered Søren a good fisherman, but not remarkable. A good neighbor, but not especially social. A good father, but not outwardly affectionate. In the words of those who knew him, he was a typical North Coast Dane. Quiet, hardworking, reliable, not dramatic. The kind of man who kept his promises without needing to say them out loud. Politically, he was indifferent. He voted sometimes, usually Social Democrat because they supported fishing cooperatives, but without ideological passion. Religiously, he was a nominal Lutheran, in church at Christmas and Easter mostly to keep Kirsten happy. Philosophically, he was practical. The world was what it was. Life was hard. You did the best you could. Nothing in Søren Falk's first 49 years suggested he would become the man who saved 110 lives. He was ordinary in every measurable sense. But ordinary, as it turned out, was exactly what the resistance would need. On April 9, 1940, at 4:15 a.m., the Wehrmacht invaded Denmark. German forces crossed the southern border as paratroopers seized key airfields. Facing overwhelming military superiority and the threat of Copenhagen being bombed, the Danish government surrendered after 6 hours. It was one of the shortest campaigns of the war. At first, the German occupation of Denmark was strangely different from other Nazi occupations. Germany needed Denmark as a model protectorate, proof that cooperative countries could thrive under Nazi rule. They allowed the Danish government to keep functioning, the king to remain, daily life to continue with minimal visible interference. For Søren and the fishermen of Gilleleje, the occupation mostly meant restrictions on fishing. Mandatory quotas sold to Germany at fixed prices, bans on certain waters labeled military zones, night curfews that cut into fishing hours. Annoying inconveniences, not catastrophe. The German soldiers stationed in Gilleleje were mostly correct. They paid for food and drink. Some even learned basic Danish words. The occupation was tense, but not brutal. Occupied Denmark looked more like a textbook occupation than what was happening in Poland or France. That uneasy coexistence held for 3 years because the Germans needed Danish cooperation, and the Danes chose not to resist openly. It was pragmatic collaboration that both sides justified as necessary. But everything changed in August 1943, when the Danish resistance began more aggressive sabotage attacks. The Germans, responded with harsher retaliation. On August 29, 1943, Germany issued an ultimatum. Denmark must declare a state of emergency and crush the resistance, or Germany would take full military control. The Danish government refused. The Germans dissolved the government, imposed direct martial law, arrested Danish politicians and military officers. The model occupation was over. The brutal occupation was beginning. And with it, the decision that would turn ordinary fishermen into extraordinary heroes. Part 2. The hunt begins. Werner Best, the German plenipotentiary in Denmark, received orders from Berlin on September 8, 1943. Implement the final solution in Denmark. Arrest and deport every Danish Jew to concentration camps. The operation was scheduled to unfold during Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, when Jews would be gathered in synagogues, making mass arrests easier. Denmark had about 7,800 Jews, most of them in Copenhagen. Compared to the Jewish populations of Poland or Hungary, it was a tiny number. But to the Nazis, racial cleansing had to be total. Every Jew had to be accounted for, arrested, deported. What the Nazis didn't anticipate was that Denmark would respond differently than any other occupied country, not because Danes were morally superior, but because Jewish integration into Danish society was so complete that Jews were simply Danes, without qualifiers. There were no Jewish ghettos in Denmark, no restrictive laws before the occupation, no tradition of institutional anti-Semitism. Danish Jews were neighbors, colleagues, friends. Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, a German naval attaché in Copenhagen, was horrified by the deportation orders. In an extraordinary act of betrayal, on September 28, 1943, he secretly contacted Danish and Jewish political leaders and laid out the Nazi plan in detail. Raids would begin the night of October 1st, continue through Rosh Hashanah, and aim to arrest every Jew within 48 hours. Duckwitz's warning triggered the most successful rescue operation of the Holocaust. Within 72 hours, virtually the entire Jewish population of Denmark had been warned, hidden, and prepared for evacuation. Churches, hospitals, universities, private families. Everyone opened doors. Danish Jews simply vanished before the raids began. But hiding was only the first step. Denmark was a small peninsula, fully occupied by Germany. There was nowhere to run inside the country. The only way out was across the Øresund, the 4-kilometer strait separating Denmark from neutral Sweden. And to cross water, you needed boats. To get boats, you needed fishermen. And the fishermen, it turned out, were willing. The news reached Gilleleje on September 29th through the local pastor, Kjeldgaard Jensen, who had received an urgent call from resistance contacts in Copenhagen. Jews need evacuation. Can the fishermen help? Jensen called an informal meeting in the back room of a harbor tavern. 17 fishermen attended, including Søren Falk. Jensen explained the situation without theatrics. The Nazis planned to arrest all Danish Jews within days. Sweden had agreed to accept Jewish refugees. Fishermen were needed to take them across. It's illegal, Jensen admitted. It's dangerous. The Germans patrol the strait constantly. If they catch you, they'll probably execute you on the spot or send you to camps. I can't promise payment. I can't promise protection. I can't promise anything, except that it's the right thing to do. A long silence followed. The fishermen looked at one another, weighing risk, thinking of their families, imagining consequences. Søren spoke first, his voice so calm the others had to lean in to hear him. I'll do it. I know these waters. I can cross without being seen. One by one, every fisherman in the room committed. 17 men who had never done anything political in their lives decided, in the same moment, to commit what Nazi law would call treason. It took less than 10 minutes. No speeches, no grand philosophy, just a pragmatic acceptance that this was what had to be done. That night, Søren went home and told Kirsten, "I'm going to take Jews across to Sweden. I'll start tomorrow. It's dangerous. You can tell me not to." Kirsten, married to Søren for 24 years, knowing him better than he knew himself, answered, "If I told you not to, would you listen?" "Probably not," Søren admitted. "Then I won't waste words. Just be careful and come back." It was the longest conversation they had about it during the entire rescue. Danes, especially North Coast Danes, didn't spend words when actions were enough. Part 3. The First Crossing. October 1st, 1943, 9 p.m. 5 people arrived at the Gilleleje Pier, a Jewish family from Copenhagen, parents with 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 12. They had traveled by train from Copenhagen, hidden under tarps in a freight car, guided to Gilleleje through the resistance network. Pastor Jensen met them and took them into the church, where they waited until full darkness. At 11 p.m., Jensen led them to Søren's boat. It was the first time Søren had seen the people he would ferry. They were painfully ordinary. A father in his 40s wearing glasses, a nervous mother gripping her children, 3 silent kids with huge eyes, full of fear. They could have been any Danish family, except for the yellow star they had ripped from their clothing, leaving stitch marks where it had been sewn on. "Can you swim?" Søren asked, his first practical question. "The children can't," the father said. "I can a little. My wife can't." Søren pulled 5 old life vests from the cabin. "Put these on. If anything happens, hold on to the boat. Don't scream, no matter what." He helped them aboard. The boat, built for 3 fishermen, sat dangerously low now, with 7 people. The gunwale was less than 20 centimeters above the water. "Sit in the center. Don't move. Don't talk. If German searchlights find us, I'll have to throw you into the water with the life vests and row away. Swim back toward the Danish coast, not the Swedish one. Understand?" The family nodded, too terrified to speak. Søren pushed off at 11:30 p.m. The night was perfect for smuggling. No moon, heavy clouds, total darkness. It was also perfect for smashing into submerged rocks Søren normally avoided using visual landmarks. He rowed in silence, each stroke calculated for the smallest sound. The water was relatively calm, waves under half a meter, which was pure luck. In rougher water, the overloaded boat could have capsized. Half a kilometer from shore, Søren heard the German patrol boat's engine before he saw it. The Germans used fast launches with powerful motors capable of catching any fishing boat. But those engines were loud, announcing themselves from kilometers away. Søren stopped, rowing, and let the boat drift. The patrol passed 800 meters to the east, its lights sweeping the water methodically. Søren counted 5 full sweeps before it continued south. He waited 10 minutes, then resumed rowing. The 4-kilometer crossing took 2 hours, 4 times longer than normal. Because Søren kept stopping to listen for engines, avoiding routes he suspected were patrolled, and steering around lit areas. At 1:30 a.m., the boat touched Swedish shore near Höganäs, a small fishing town on the Swedish side. Søren had been there dozens of times on pre-war fishing trips. He knew the area. The family stepped onto Swedish land on shaking legs after 2 hours sitting motionless in freezing air. The father tried to thank Søren, searching for the right words for gratitude that big. Søren cut him off. Walk toward town. Swedish police will find you. They'll take care of you. Good luck." He shoved the boat back into the water before they could answer. The return trip was faster without cargo, only 90 minutes. He reached Gilleleje at 3:45 a.m. Kirsten was awake waiting, as she would be every night for the next 3 weeks. She didn't ask how it went. She simply set out hot coffee and bread. Søren ate in silence, slept 4 hours, woke at 8 a.m., and prepared the boat for the next night's crossing. 5 lives saved, 105 to go. Part 4. The system takes shape. The Danish evacuation was massive improvisation that somehow worked because everyone improvised together. There was no master plan, no central coordination, no command structure. It was organized chaos, driven by absolute necessity and an impossible timetable. In Copenhagen, the resistance organized transport from urban hiding places to coastal towns. They used ambulances with Jews disguised as patients, garbage trucks with people hidden under waste, ordinary trains where Jews traveled with forged papers. The system was dangerous, but it worked because non-Jewish Danes cooperated almost universally. Train conductors looked the other way. Danish police warned of German checks. Office clerks forged documents without charging a krone. In coastal towns like Gilleleje, Snekkersten, Humlebæk, Espergærde, fishermen turned their working boats into refugee ferries. Every night, dozens of boats crossed the strait loaded with Jews. It was smuggling on an industrial scale, run by amateurs learning as they went. After the first chaotic trips, Søren developed a system quickly. He laid down rules and shared them with other fishermen. Rule 1. No more than 7 passengers per boat. Any more and the boat rode dangerously low, vulnerable to waves and harder to steer. Rule 2. Only cross on moonless nights. Moonlight gave German patrols too much visibility. The darkest nights were the safest. Rule 3. Absolute silence. 1 scream, 1 crying baby. Any sound could draw a patrol. Søren began carrying laudanum drops to sedate babies and small children during crossings. Rule 4. Vary the routes. Never take the same route 2 nights in a row. The Germans learned patterns. Unpredictability was survival. Rule 5. No heroics. If a patrol came too close, Søren would throw the passengers into the water with life vests and row away. The Germans wouldn't shoot a lone fisherman. Passengers floating in vests might be picked up and deported rather than executed on the water. It was horrific, but practical. He never had to use the rule, but every passenger knew it was possible. The cost of a crossing was officially a voluntary donation, but in practice it was 1,000 to 2,000 Danish kroner per person, roughly $3,000 to $6,000 in today's money. It was a fortune for working-class families, but Søren didn't bargain. If you have money, you pay. If you don't, you go for free. But if you have money and refuse to pay, you don't go. About 40% of his passengers paid, 60% crossed for free or with partial payment. The money he took went to fuel, when he used a motor instead of oars, boat maintenance, occasional bribes to corrupt German guards, and he split the rest with other fishermen who had fewer paying passengers. It wasn't a profitable business. After expenses, Søren earned less than he did fishing. But the money from those who could pay subsidized those who couldn't, making the whole operation financially sustainable. Coordination on the Swedish side was surprisingly efficient. Swedish authorities set up reception points along the coast, where Jewish refugees were processed, registered, housed, and fed. Sweden, officially neutral but sympathetic to the Allies, took in every Jewish refugee without exception. The scale was staggering. In 3 weeks during October 1943, around 7,200 of Denmark's 7,800 Jews were evacuated to Sweden. Only about 580 were captured, and most of them survived the war because Denmark pressured the Germans to send them to Theresienstadt instead of Auschwitz, and kept sending aid packages. It was the highest survival rate of any Jewish population in Nazi-occupied Europe. Not because Danes were born heroes, but because Danish society made it impossible to carry out the final solution without massive Danish cooperation. And that cooperation never came. Part 5. Moonless Nights. Søren's crossing settled into a pattern that became routine through October 1943. Every moonless night, Pastor Jensen or a resistance contact brought passengers to the harbor around 11 p.m. Søren loaded them, crossed the strait, put them ashore in Sweden, and returned before dawn. On the best nights, he managed 2 trips, carrying 14 people. On nights with heavy patrols, he only made 1 run with 7. On nights of storms or a full moon, he took no one at all. He kept a mental ledger of every crossing. He wrote nothing down. Papers were evidence. But he memorized numbers, faces, and names when people shared them. Crossing number 5, October 4th. An elderly couple, both over 70, with arthritis so severe that sitting still for 2 hours was agony. The husband had a weak bladder and urinated in the boat. Søren washed the deck afterward with seawater and said nothing. Crossing number 7, October 6th. A single mother with 4 children, ages 3 to 14. The youngest cried uncontrollably. Søren used laudanum drops, probably too many. But silence was life or death. The child slept 18 hours after reaching Sweden, but he lived. Crossing number 9, October 8th. A rabbi with a Torah scroll rescued from a Copenhagen synagogue. The bundle weighed nearly 20 kilos, wrapped in canvas. The rabbi insisted on bringing it. Søren allowed it, even though it threw off the boat's balance. Some passengers were only bodies. Others were bodies plus souls. The rabbi was soul plus Torah. Crossing number 11, October 10th. A 16-year-old boy, alone. His parents arrested 2 days earlier. He was catatonic from shock. He didn't speak the entire way, didn't react even when they stepped onto Swedish soil. Søren handed him to Swedish authorities and never learned what became of him. Some people were saved physically and still shattered inside. Crossing number 13, October 12th. A German patrol passed within 50 meters. Søren could see sailors' faces and binoculars. They were looking straight toward his boat, but they didn't see. Because the night was so black and Søren had extinguished everything, even the faint glow of his compass. He stayed absolutely still for 15 minutes after the patrol moved on, waiting for his heart to stop pounding so hard he was sure the Germans could hear it. Crossing number 16, October 15th. A wealthy Copenhagen family with suitcases stuffed with jewelry, cash, documents. They wanted to bring 3 large cases. Søren said 1 small bag or nothing. They argued. Søren didn't budge. They left 2 suitcases on the pier. Wealth abandoned because space in the boat was worth more than gold. Crossing number 18, October 17th. A woman, 8 months pregnant. Søren nearly refused. Too risky if she went into labor mid-crossing. But she begged. She had no other option. Her husband had been arrested. Søren gave in. She didn't give birth in the boat. She gave birth 3 weeks later in a Swedish hospital. A healthy boy. She gave him Søren as a middle name. Crossing number 20, October 19th. A Jewish doctor who had treated Søren's son Lars for pneumonia 3 years earlier. Lars had almost died. The doctor had come every day for 2 weeks and refused payment because the Falk family had no money. Now Søren was carrying that doctor to safety, a circle closing, a debt repaid. Crossing number 22, October 21st. A sudden storm, 2-meter waves, water sloshing into the boat. Søren had to choose speed, using the motor and risking being heard, or quiet, rowing and risking sinking. He chose the motor. He crossed in 45 minutes at a dangerous pace. A German patrol heard them, but by the time it reached the Sound, they were already in Swedish waters. The border, nothing but an invisible line, saved lives. Crossing number 24, October 23rd. 11 people, more than he'd ever carried. Søren had set the rule at 7, but these were the last known Jews in Gilleleje. They all had to leave that night. He broke his own rule. The boat was so overloaded that water spilled over the edges. He crossed while bailing continuously with a coffee cup. He reached Sweden with the boat nearly sinking. It was foolish. It was necessary. And it worked. Every crossing was different. Every crossing was the same. Darkness, fear, water, hope. Søren became an expert at reading terror in faces. Fear that froze people versus fear that sharpened them. Manageable fear versus panic that killed. He learned how to steady passengers with a calm voice, steady hands, a confidence he didn't always feel but could project. The Germans added patrols night after night. They adapted. Søren adapted too. It was a lethal chess match played on black water, where a single mistake meant death. But Søren had advantages the Germans couldn't match. He knew every current, every shoal, every inlet across 50 kilometers of coastline. He'd fished these waters for 30 years. The Germans had maps. Søren had lived knowledge, tacit understanding that can't be taught, the kind of wisdom absorbed through decades of physical experience. He knew where currents ran strongest, where he could drift without rowing and without noise. He knew where sandbars created shallows that deep patrol boats couldn't navigate. He knew how to read the stars when they showed between clouds, how to orient by current when stars vanished, how to feel the wind on his face and use it like a compass. It was experience versus training, intuition versus protocol, 30 years versus 3 months. And on a moonless sea, experience won. Part 6. The near captures. Not every crossing ended well. Other fishermen from Gilleleje and nearby towns were also ferrying refugees, and not all of them had Søren's experience or his luck. On October 7th, fisherman Jens Nielsen was intercepted by a German patrol half a kilometer off the Danish coast with 5 Jewish refugees aboard. The Germans opened fire without warning. Nielsen was wounded, 2 refugees were killed, 3 were captured. Nielsen was sent to prison. He survived the war, but never fished again, broken by the 2 deaths in his boat. On October 14th, fisherman Mads Petersen capsized his overloaded boat in rough water. 4 of 6 passengers drowned before he could pull them back. The 2 survivors reached Sweden, but Petersen lived with unbearable guilt and eventually took his own life in 1947. On October 18th, fisherman Carl Hansen was betrayed by a Danish collaborator who reported his operation to the Germans. Hansen was arrested before he could depart, along with his 6 passengers. All were deported to Theresienstadt. Hansen died there in January 1945, only weeks before. Liberation. Søren knew these men. He'd fished with them, drank with them, stood at their children's weddings. Their arrests and deaths were constant reminders that what he was doing was survival with 0 margin for error. Søren's closest call came on October 20th, during crossing number 21. he was 2 kilometers from the Danish coast, midway across the strait, when 2 things happened at the same time. His 8-year-old passenger began a coughing fit, and a German patrol boat appeared 200 meters away. The child coughed uncontrollably, deep, explosive coughs that carried across the water. Søren made an instant decision. He clamped his hand over the boy's mouth and pressed hard to smother the sound. The child fought, panic in his eyes, thinking Søren was trying to suffocate him. The boy's mother understood. She held her son's body still while Søren kept pressure. The boy couldn't breathe. His lips started to turn blue, but he couldn't cough either. The patrol boat slowed. Søren could see the searchlight sweeping closer. His arm trembled from the effort of holding the boy's mouth shut while the child struggled under his grip. 30 seconds. The boy was clearly choking now, eyes rolling back. Søren faced a choice: release him and let the coughing reveal them, or keep pressing and possibly kill the boy. 40 seconds. The beam was within 50 meters. Søren could hear German voices, casual conversation about the cold. 45 seconds. Søren's fingers were white with pressure. The boy stopped struggling, unconscious or dead. Søren couldn't tell. 50 seconds. The beam passed within 30 meters and still didn't catch them in the absolute darkness. The patrol boat moved on, its engine fading away. Søren released his hand immediately. The child was unconscious, but when air finally returned to his lungs, he began breathing again. He coughed violently for 5 minutes, but by then the patrol was a kilometer away and couldn't hear. The boy woke up terrified and crying. His mother held him, crying too. Søren didn't apologize because he didn't feel sorry. He had done exactly what was required. The child was alive. Everyone was alive. That was all that mattered. They reached Sweden 30 minutes later. When they stepped ashore, the mother said, "You almost killed my son." "Yes," Søren replied. "It was that, or let him cough and get you all killed. I chose the option with the most survivors." She stared at him, absorbing the brutal logic. Then she nodded once. "Thank you," she said, "for doing what I couldn't have done." Søren never learned the boy's name. He only remembered the terror in his eyes, those 50 seconds, the longest of his life. Part 7. The Cost of Rescue. The Falk family paid a price for Søren's actions, even though they weren't the ones crossing refugees. The Germans suspected every fisherman in Gilleleje, but they had no hard evidence against specific individuals, so they applied pressure broadly. Lars, Søren's oldest son, 23, was arrested on October 15th for questioning about resistance activity. The Germans held him for 3 days and beat him moderately. Bruised ribs, a black eye, a broken finger, then released him without charges. He couldn't give them information because he genuinely didn't know details of his father's work. Søren had never told Lars exactly what he was doing. It was protection. What Lars didn't know, he couldn't reveal under torture. When Lars came home battered, he asked directly, "Are you taking Jews across?" "Yes," Søren said. There was no point lying now. "They'll kill you if they catch you." "Probably. Is it worth it?" Søren took a long time before answering. "I don't know, but I can't not do it. Does that make sense?" Lars nodded slowly. "I guess it does. Be careful, Dad." It was the most personal conversation Søren and Lars had had in years. The Falk men weren't emotional, but shared danger created an intimacy peace never produced. Bjørn, the middle son, worked at a shipyard in Helsingør, far from Gilleleje. The Germans questioned him about his father, but Björn truly knew nothing. He worked 12-hour shifts and rarely made it home. Astrid, the daughter, 18, knew exactly what her father was doing and began helping. She acted as a messenger between Pastor Jensen and Søren, carrying information about passengers without using the telephone, which might be tapped. She also prepared supplies for the crossings: water, bread, blankets. On October 25th, Astrid was stopped by a German patrol while walking to the harbor with a backpack full of supplies. A young German soldier, no more than 20, halted her and searched the bag. "What is this for?" he asked in rough German, pointing at the water bottles and blankets. "For my father," Astrid answered in Danish, pretending she didn't understand him. "He's a fisherman. He goes out tonight." The soldier stared suspiciously, but he had no proof of anything illegal. Water and blankets were normal fishing supplies. He let her go with a warning: curfew at 8 p.m., not in the street after. Astrid reached the harbor shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. She told Søren what had happened. Søren forbade her from making any more deliveries. It was too risky. Astrid ignored the ban. She kept helping, but more carefully, taking different routes, changing times. Kirsten handled the stress differently. She didn't ask about crossings, didn't argue about danger. She simply made coffee every night when Søren returned and stayed awake until he arrived. If he wasn't back by 5 a.m., she would know something had gone wrong. The tension of waiting each night aged her visibly. In October 1943, she developed gray hair she hadn't had in September. Lines deepened in her face. She began smoking for the first time in her life, just to have something to do with anxious hands. One night, after a particularly close call, Kirsten finally spoke. "How much longer?" "I don't know," Søren admitted, "until everyone who wants to go has gone. And if they catch you, then they catch me. And me? And the children?" It was an impossible question, because Søren had no answer. He was choosing between the safety of strangers and the safety of his family. It was a moral calculation he couldn't fully rationalize. He could only act. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I only know that if I stay home and let people die when I can save them, I won't be able to live with myself. I'd rather die doing the right thing than live knowing I did nothing." Kirsten didn't reply. She poured more coffee, and they waited for dawn together. The financial cost was real too. The money from paying passengers barely covered expenses. Søren's normal fishing work was abandoned throughout October. He had no time or energy to fish commercially while ferrying refugees. The Falk family lived off savings, burning through money accumulated over years at sea. By the end of October, they had spent the equivalent of 6 months of income. If the operation continued, they would soon be ruined. But in a world of life and death, bankruptcy felt like a minor consequence. Søren could earn money again after the war. He could not bring back the lives he failed to save. Part 8. The Last Crossings. By the end of October 1943, the mass evacuation was almost complete. Most Danish Jews were either in Sweden or hidden so deeply the Germans couldn't find them. The flow of refugees into Gillelejo shrank, from dozens per night to a handful. Søren's final crossings were different from the first ones. The people still left to move were the hardest to move. Those without money or connections, those with complicated medical conditions, those who had waited too long and were now desperate. Crossing number 25, October 26th. An 80-year-old man with dementia, accompanied by his 50-year-old daughter. He didn't understand where he was or why. During the crossing, he kept asking out loud, again and again, "Where are we?" His daughter tried to calm him, but Søren knew a German patrol would hear him easily. They were lucky. No patrols that night. Crossing number 26, October 27th. A blind woman with her brother. The blindness made everything harder. She needed constant guidance, became disoriented instantly, panicked without visual reference. Her brother was endlessly patient, whispering direction to her the entire way. They made it across, but Søren had never seen terror so pure in the eyes of someone who couldn't even see the danger she was facing. Crossing number 27, October 28th. One person alone, a 19-year-old, the last surviving member of a family of 8. His parents, 4 brothers, and sister had been arrested 4 days earlier. He escaped only because he'd been visiting friends. He cried silently through the whole crossing. Søren didn't try to comfort him. There were no words. Crossing number 28, October 29th. A newlywed couple, married only 3 weeks earlier. They had planned a honeymoon in Italy. Instead, they were fleeing as refugees. They still wore their wedding rings. They held hands the entire way, gripping each other as if letting go meant disappearing. Tenderness in the middle of horror. Crossing number 29, October 30th. A university professor with a box of manuscripts, his life's research on medieval Danish history. It weighed 15 kilos. Søren said no. Too heavy, the professor begged. This was his life's work. Søren gave in because he understood that some people value their work as much as life. The manuscripts survived. They were published after the war and became a standard text. Some rescues are made of paper as well as people. Crossing number 30, October 31st. A 12-year-old girl alone. Her parents had sent her ahead, planning to follow. Søren knew the moment he looked at her that they wouldn't come. They had saved her by sacrificing themselves. The girl didn't understand yet. She believed she'd be reunited with them in Sweden. Søren didn't correct her. Some truths can wait. By early November, the stream stopped entirely. No more refugees arrived in Gilleleje. Those still in Denmark were hidden so thoroughly that even the resistance didn't know where, or they had already been caught. Søren had carried 110 people in 30 crossings over 4 weeks. Other fishermen from Gilleleje had carried hundreds more. Together, the fishermen of the town had evacuated around 1,000 people. Roughly 14% of all Danish Jews saved. On November 3rd, Søren made a final inspection of the boat, cleaning away evidence of the crossings, forgotten blankets, empty water bottles, a child's lost handkerchief. Between the floorboards, he found a small pendant, a Star of David on a silver chain. Someone had dropped it during a frantic crossing. He slipped it into his pocket, thinking he might return it if he ever found the owner. He never did. The pendant stayed in his pocket for the rest of the war, a physical reminder of people he had saved, whose names he would never know. Part 9. After the silence. The Germans never arrested Søren Falk. They suspected him, investigated, questioned neighbors, but they never found direct evidence. Søren was obsessively careful. He wrote nothing down, spoke to no one who didn't need to know, never kept passengers' money. He spent it immediately or passed it along. Never bragged. Other fishermen were less careful or less lucky. 17 fishermen from Gilleleje were arrested during and after the rescue operation. 5 died in concentration camps. Those who returned after the war came back physically broken and psychologically scarred. Søren simply went on fishing. When the rescue operation ended in November 1943, he returned to commercial herring fishing as if October had never happened. To an outside observer, he looked like any other Danish fisherman surviving the occupation. Denmark was liberated on May 5, 1945, when Germany surrendered. Søren was 54, physically worn down by the strain of years at sea and the crushing stress of October 1943, but alive. In the weeks after liberation, Danish Jews began returning from Sweden. Denmark was the only occupied country in Europe where Jews returned to find their homes, businesses, and possessions mostly intact. Danish neighbors had protected Jewish property, paid rent, kept shops running. Some of Søren's passengers came looking for him to say thank you. They found a quiet, 54-year-old fisherman who seemed uncomfortable with attention. When asked about the crossings, he answered with the bare minimum. "I did what anyone would have done. It wasn't a big thing." But it was a big thing. Søren had risked his life, his family, and his livelihood to save 110 strangers because he simply couldn't do otherwise. In 1953, Yad Vashem created the Righteous Among the Nations program to honor non-Jews who saved Jews during the Holocaust. Søren Falk was nominated in 1971 by 3 families he had carried across. He refused at first. "I didn't do anything special. I just took people across in a boat." The commission persisted. Søren finally accepted in 1974, traveling to Israel at 83 to receive the medal and certificate. The ceremony visibly unsettled him. He disliked being the center of attention. When an Israeli reporter asked what had motivated him, Søren took a long time before answering. "I knew the sea. I knew the danger. I knew the risk. But I also knew that on the other side of the water that there was life. Here, there was death. The choice seemed obvious." "Were you ever afraid?" the reporter asked. "Every damn night," Søren admitted. But fear isn't a reason not to do what's right. Fear is only a feeling. What's right is action. I chose action. Søren Falk died on August 17, 1979, at 88, in Gilleleje, in the same house where he'd been born, 50 meters from the harbor where he had saved 110 lives. His funeral was simple, attended by family, fellow fishermen, and, surprisingly, a large group of strangers who had come from all over Denmark and Israel. Passengers he had carried across 36 years earlier. One of the speakers was Meyer Goldstein, whom Søren had ferried on October 15, 1943, when Goldstein was 9 years old. Goldstein, now a physics professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, spoke about the boatman who had saved his life. Søren Falk never thought of himself as a hero. That was part of his heroism. He did the extraordinary while insisting it was ordinary. He risked everything while minimizing the risk. He saved lives while arguing he was simply doing his job. The lesson of Søren Falk is not that some humans are exceptional heroes. The lesson is that all humans are capable of heroism when they choose action instead of watching, when they choose compassion instead of indifference, when they choose risk instead of safety. My life exists because a Danish fisherman chose to row across black water into unknown danger. My family exists because that same fisherman made that choice not once, but 30 times. The lives of 109 other people exist for the same reason. Søren Falk taught us that ordinary courage is the most powerful kind because it is available to everyone. You don't have to be a soldier, a genius, or a saint. You only have to be a person willing to do what is right when it is hard. Søren was a ferryman. He took people across water. That was literally his work. But by choosing whom to carry, and when, and why, he transformed an ordinary trade into extraordinary salvation. The world is full of water that separates. Søren Falk taught us that every separation can be crossed if someone is willing to take up the oars. The Star of David pendant Søren had found in his boat in November 1943 was still in his pocket when he died. He had never returned it because he never found its owner. His family buried him with it. Someone anonymous, one of the 110, had lost that pendant during a terrifying crossing through black water. Søren had carried it for 36 years, a symbol of a connection that outlasts identity. He didn't need names to save lives. He only needed to know that lives needed saving. The boat Søren used in October 1943 still exists today, preserved in the Danish Resistance Museum in Copenhagen. It's an ordinary fishing boat. Weathered wood, worn benches, still smelling of salt and thyme. But look at it knowing what it carried. 110 people, 30 crossings, 0 captures. And it stops being ordinary. It becomes an arc, a bridge, a line between death and life. The Nazis built an empire of death with industrial technology, totalitarian ideology, and systematic violence. Against that, Søren Falk had only a boat, knowledge of water, and the stubborn decision that some separations must be crossed no matter the risk. The empire fell. The boat remains. On plaques in the museum, the names of the 110 people Søren carried to Sweden in October 1943 are engraved. Next to each name is the date of the crossing. At the bottom of the list is a simple inscription. Carried across by a boatman who knew the sea, understood the danger, and chose anyway. 110 lives, 30 nights. One ordinary man doing extraordinary things because he simply couldn't do otherwise. The Germans patrolled with fast launches, searchlights, weapons. Søren Falk rowed with a wooden boat, knowledge of the water, and faith that life was worth the risk. In the end, the oars defeated the patrol boats, not because they were stronger, but because they were held by hands that refused to let go. The Øresund still separates Denmark from Sweden, 4 kilometers of water that, in 1943, meant the difference between life and death. Søren Falk crossed that line 30 times, carrying hope in a wooden boat. The distance hasn't changed, but the meaning was transformed forever by a boatman who chose to row toward danger instead of away from it. The moonless nights that once hid refugees now hide only water. But the memory remains of a boat cutting through darkness, of lives saved by ordinary courage, of a ferryman who proved that heroism doesn't require anything extraordinary. It only requires the choice to act when others choose to look away. Søren Falk carried 110 Jews to safety on moonless nights. He wasn't the only fisherman who did it. He wasn't the one who carried the most. He wasn't the most famous. But he was the one who did what had to be done when it needed to be done. Without drama, without hesitation, without expecting recognition. And that, in the end, is the Chistesha definition of heroism. Doing what is right simply because it is right, no matter the cost, no matter the risk, no matter if no one ever knows. The Nazis never caught Søren Falk. They never understood how an ordinary boatman defeated them. They never discovered that the most dangerous heroism is the kind that looks ordinary, until it's too late to stop it. 110 lives, 30 nights, 1 boat, 1 man, 1 choice, repeated 30 times. Row into danger, because on the other side waited life. The Germans controlled the land, the air, the law. Søren Falk controlled the water, and the water was the road to freedom. In the end, the water won, and 110 people lived to tell the story of a ferryman who simply couldn't stay on the shore while others drowned.